Good afternoon. So pleased to welcome you to today's lecture. My name is Anne Leonard. I'm the Manton Curator of Prince Drawings and Photographs at the Clark. Very pleased to have you here. It seems unusually dark in the room. There may be a reason for that. Again, thank you for coming to today's lecture. It's highly anticipated by scholar Richard Taws, whom it will be my pleasure to introduce in just a moment. I did want to note that we have a closing weekend concert on Saturday, March 7th to cap off the exhibition run. So we are in the final 2 weeks of the exhibition. Details of that concert are on our website. And I did also want to acknowledge major funding for Shadow Visionaries that has been provided by Hugo and Mireille Goldschmidt. We have the honor of having them here with us today. Thank you so much. With additional support from the IFPDA Foundation and the Trube Family Foundation. And so now let me introduce Richard Taws. Richard is professor and head of the Department of History of Art at University College London. A specialist in 18th and 19th century art with an emphasis on modern France, his research has focused on everyday, ephemeral, or obsolete forms of visual and material culture, the social and political stakes of printed images, and histories and theories of science, media, and technology from the 18th century to the present. His publications include Time Machines, Telegraphic Images in 19th Century France, MIT Press 2025, which was just recently awarded the 2026 Charles Rufus Maury Book Award of the College Art Association. Congratulations. And The Politics of the Provisional, Art and Ephemera in Revolutionary France from Penn State University Press in 2013. As well as the co-edited books, A Companion to French Art with Natalie Adamson, published by Wiley in 2026. You've been busy. Time, Media, and Visuality in Post-Revolutionary France with Iris Moon from Bloomsbury in 2021. And Art and Technology in Early Modern Europe with Genevieve Warwick from Wiley in 2016. As a member of the Multigraph Collective, Richard co-authored Interacting with Print, Elements of Reading in the Era of Print Saturation, University of Chicago Press, 2018. He is also a curator. So in 2016, he curated with David Bindman, Revolution Under a King, French Prince, 1789 to 1792. And in 2020, with David Bindman and Colin Jones, Witnessing Terror, French Revolutionary Prince, 1792 to 94, and both of those exhibitions were at the University College London Art Museum. He has been the recipient of fellowships from the Getty, the Bard Graduate Center, Leverhulme Trust, the British Academy, and the Institute for Advanced Study, Princeton. And he is an editor of Oxford Art Journal. And Richard has given us a very enticing title today for his talk, Exiled on the Earth, Nature, Technology, and Risk. So please join me in warmly welcoming Richard Taws to the podium.
Thank you so much, Anne. And to the team at the Clark, I'd especially like to thank Will Schmenner for help getting me here. And thank you all for coming out on this very beautiful but rather wintry weekend. If you'll permit me the indulgence of an opening digression, the art of the Shadow Visionaries, and I'm really grateful that we now have a term to describe these artists, was central to my recent book, Time Machines, that Anne just mentioned, which looks at the intersection between 19th century visual culture and the period's communications infrastructure, the optical or semaphoric telegraph in particular. From atmospheric photographs of the telegraph in situ, Fizeau here, to equally moody drawings, Victor Hugo on the right, who was fascinated and appalled by the network, figuring it here as a kind of visual noise, and prints showing the machine's invasion of space, the apparatus occupying the amputated Gothic tower of Notre-Dame de l'Épine. These artists in different ways looked to modern technology's intersection with the past to rethink their relationship to time and history in ways that I think are consonant with this show. Some artists, from Goya to Nadar, had fun burlesquing the telegraph's rotating limbs, and it's perhaps hard to make a case for Nadar as a shadow artist. With his red hair and scarlet robes, Nadar was one of the most famous people in Paris, and as Michel Ardan, he features in Verne's Journey to the Moon on the right-hand side. Although, as this exhibition shows, Nadar, too, married rational modernity with an aesthetic that was decidedly eerie. For some artists, Granville here, modern communications were mystical and secretive, replete with politically suspect, spooky affects. The telegraph, too, hovered over the quarries at Montmartre, Chifflard, in a work from the exhibition, as the machine there was one of the most prominent in Paris, plonked on top of a medieval church, its acceleration of information in dialogue with the deep time of the fossils in Montmartre's gypsum mines below. The optical telegraph, introduced in 1794, saw its last official use in 1855 at the siege of Sevastopol, leaving the skies of France, as in Marville's wonderful photograph, untroubled by its angular choreography. That was a lot of images in a very short space of time. There's a lot more I could say about this intersection of technology, media, and shadow visionaries, but I'm going to move on now, as this mid-century point is where I want to begin my discussion of one artist in particular, French printmaker Charles Meryon, featured prominently in the exhibition, who was uniquely invested in the coming together of ancient and modern nature and technology, and too in the affective properties of the sky. All this to say that the themes of this wonderful exhibition map really well onto things I've been thinking about in the past and for the future, so it's a real delight to be here and to see the exhibition. In the mid-1850s, Meryon made some images that spoke to questions of financial speculation and risk. Meryon is best known today for the Eaux sur Paris, the distinctive neo-Gothic visions of the capital he made around the same time, between 1850 and 1854. And I'm showing here the frontispiece, featuring a piece of stone with lettering raised as if for relief printing, its lithic surface cracked, mossed, and riddled with fossils, as if it had just been excavated. In these prints, in the words of art historian Michael Camille, there's a sense of things stared at for so long that the gaze has pushed through to the other side of the reel, to a parallel universe where everything is identical but slightly, oddly different. Meryon's image of the Paris morgue from the series is exemplary of this effect. Its raking shadows, febrile atmosphere, and uncertain historical framing, both new and old at the same time, producing an uncanny, somewhat queasy sense of dislocation. Meryon's work and tragic biography were amply described by friends and associates, including critics and artists Théophile Gautier, Félix Braquemont, Eugène Blériot, and Philippe Burti. Meanwhile, for Victor Hugo, writing to Burti, the breadth of immensity runs through Meryon's work and makes his etchings more than paintings, visions. But this recognition came late. He received no significant notice until 1859, and the Eaux sur Paris, placed on sale at the Prince Cellar Vinière in 1854, were a commercial failure, as were his salon showings. The critical understanding of Meryon's work has subsequently been shaped by the outsized influence of two of his most perceptive interpreters, Charles Baudelaire and Walter Benjamin, for whom Meryon's vertiginous etchings of the city, constituting, in Benjamin's words, the death mask of old Paris, operated as allegories for the dialectical character of modernity. Baudelaire was, as Benjamin noted, born in the same year as Meryon, dying 1 year before him, and in many ways their lives and careers shadowed one another's. Baudelaire praised the print's paradoxical beauty, and he proposed writing lines to accompany them, an offer that Meryon characteristically rejected. Who says no to Baudelaire? I don't know. As has been observed, both Meryon and Baudelaire developed an aesthetic agenda characterized by an ability to render compatible the extraordinary and the ordinary, the strange and the commonplace. And it's from Baudelaire that I take my title, from the albatross in Les Fleurs de Mal. The poet is like the prince of clouds, who haunts the tempest and mocks the archer. Exiled on the earth, in the midst of derision, his giant wings keep him from walking. For reasons I'll describe, Exiled on the earth seems a pretty good description of Meryon's world. Albatrosses, those creatures of variable fortune, we'll encounter again too. My intention in this talk is not, however, to probe further such aesthetic alignments. Rather, I want to stress how making equivalences between and rendering objective the extraordinary and the ordinary describes a process that might reroute visionariness as a kind of speculation. In other words, that the eerie sense of loss found so readily in his work and in that of others in this exhibition had a social dimension, as the exhibition acknowledges, which in Meryon's case, I suggest, might also be described as fundamentally actuarial in nature. As François Ewald has observed, building on the work of Michel Foucault and Georges Canguilhem, the 19th century saw the emergence of the norm as a central component of modern power. Measurement, common standards, and a focus on the average became central to new ways of organizing and policing the relationship between the pathological and the normal. Meryon, who suffered extended periods of mental ill health, was himself subject to these processes. As insurance practices of restitution and the indemnification of damages were developed through the century, alongside institutions that governed public and private schemes, so the estimation of risk became a pervasive component of life, cross-pollinating with other forms of speculation, from stock markets to savings accounts, futures trading to property development. As Jonathan Levy puts it, during the 19th century, it became all but impossible to imagine the modern condition without the word risk. Emerging from a maritime context, in which risks were strictly financial instruments developed to manage the perils of seaborne trade, the spread of capitalism, Levy writes, brought the insecurity of the sea to the land. Meryon's work and career articulate more sharply than most artists of the time the promises and failures of this actuarial culture, which frequently took form at the horizon of visibility, in the shadows. As Ewald points out, in an actuarial context, risk isn't an event or even a particular type of risky behavior, for nothing in itself is a risk. Risks have no real existence, although conversely anything can be one, which certainly makes them feel real. Rather, risk is a category of understanding, both objective and objectifying, which allows insurers, the most adept, although not, I stress, the only technicians of risk, artists were too, to render visible and comprehensible what would appear to be only hazards of individual concern. Risks, in other words, are manufactured. As Ewald puts it, as a technology of risk, insurance is first of all a rational outline, a means of disassembling, reconstructing, and organizing certain elements of reality. The calibration and reorganization of reality has, since their first display, been considered characteristic of Meryon's Paris prints. So these seemingly disparate formations of the real, in art and in insurance, might therefore be profitably considered together. Such concerns also shaped perceptions of Meryon's psychological ill health, which from the beginning was entangled with his work's interpretation. And this was a struggle Meryon himself described. Writing to his father, Meryon voiced delusions of a plot involving his replacement by an impostor and described his discovery of a series of machinations and intrigues, of which I am almost, if not quite, the pivot, in which the greatest number of my old friends' relations and acquaintances are mixed up. Only Meryon could see through this miasma of truth to the risks it obscured. To close my letter, my last words are, surrender yourself, if not unconditionally, at least nearly so, to reality. Enthusiasts for Meryon's work in his lifetime and after took him as his word. Actuarial techniques for producing social reality weren't always transparently visible on the surface of Meryon's works, in the sense of overt references to their day-to-day business. But the pervasive risk world that insurance emblematized could be found there in abundance. Meryon's Eaux-Fortes-sur-Paris, replete with rickety thickets of scaffolding, crumbling masonry and engulfing shadows, showed a majestic architecture on the brink of collapse. Tiny figures crowd quays, float precarious craft, or dangle from ropes, dwarfed and threatened by the terrifying mass of the city that is the print's subject. Elsewhere, Meryon's images of seafaring, colonial trade, and real estate development depicted enterprises marked by protection against liability or disaster and by the loss adjuster's judgment. While his crepuscular Paris prints were suffused with reverie and menace, his images of overseas subjects were often meticulous and his drawings frequently annotated to ensure precision and objectivity. Urban dangers were a lurking presence in Meryon's work. Take the brooding Rue des Mauvais Garçons on the left, with its ominous pair of bad boys. But so were ways of managing these perils. What if we understand the fantasy of production and collapse that Meryon's Paris prints adumbrate? Their vision of a city whose grandly decaying structures were doomed by the violence of Haussmannization's first phase, and their scintillating sense of presence, combined with a palpable, if eerie, feeling of loss, as folded into actuarial techniques that also sought to calibrate such things. Meryon's Paris prints, I'm suggesting, were risk images. However, the risk they represented wasn't only a matter of regularizing through the frame of architectural change norms and pathologies, or put differently, the commonplace and the extraordinary. Neither was it solely the kind of artistic risk-taking that modernist art critic Clement Greenberg later identified in Meryon's prints. In an interview following seminars given at Bennington College in 1971, Greenberg was asked about the attention to craft discernible in the works of artists such as Meryon or Canaletto. And the interviewer seemed to offer these as examples of the least contemporary and presumably least intellectually complex artists possible. But Greenberg's answer was surprising. Claiming to admire Meryon very much, Meryon, Greenberg insisted, always kept making decisions. The mark of a practice that began and ended with craft would be that all the choices would be determined in advance. In contrast, Meryon kept making judgments all the way along, rendering his works art. I mean, take the Meryon that was in the Stein collection at MoMA, Greenberg summarized. That wasn't as well made as it was, just as a print. There was inspiration and risk-taking that went into the well-madeness of that print. He was right. Meryon was, without a doubt, a technical and artistic risk-taker when it came to his print's production. And of course, all printmaking processes are to some extent risky, with outcomes that can't always be predicted. But the well-madeness of the etchings, which with Greenberg exceeded mere competence and embraced contingency, extended beyond their facture or their appearance, encompassing wider concerns and erratic risks in more historically specific ways. Berti, in the first of two foundational articles on Meryon published in 1863, characterized him as an artist who worked alone, untutored and naive, unfollowed and unique, a wild talent unmoored from convention. The artist's fraught biography and character lent themselves to such romanticism. But Berti's certainty about the absolutely personal quality of Meryon's prints concealed the social and often overtly political circumstances of their production. Meryon's prints played an important role in the production of an oniric fantasy of Le Vieux Paris, one that held sway until the following century when Alfred Robida's medievalist reconstruction of part of the pre-Haussmann city took center stage at the Exposition Universelle, a kind of 19th-century Disneyland. However, his work might also be oriented away from the metropole towards more transnational networks of people and things. Although they were made in Paris, several works referred to distant places and events, while indigenous people, craft, and birds from the South Seas appeared in his works. Meryon made images of plants, animals, fungi, and the landscapes that contained them, many becoming increasingly disfigured by European intervention and exploitation for resources. And at times he appeared alert to what we might now consider the ecological impact of the capital projects he documented. While Meryon frequently ascribed a utopian quality to these Polynesian elements. The violence of French colonialism was never far away, a violence that, as Ian Balcom and others have shown, was predicated on the actuarial calibration of risk, central to enslavement and theft, within whose deathly circuits insurance took form as an industry. By focusing on Meryon's connections to construction and extraction schemes, colonial expansion, lotteries, mass emigration, and exile, we encounter a body of work preoccupied with questions of material and financial risk on a scale that involved, but wasn't limited to, the French capital. Seen this way, Meryon's work, and with it a familiar image of 19th century Paris, can be understood as marked by French mercantile travel, colonial commerce, speculative property development, as well as mining, whaling, and other dirty, risky businesses, and their consequences nearby and far away. Around 1855, the year after the last of the Eaux-Fortes sur Paris were published, Meryon made a pair of images, now identified as share certificate proofs, for an unrealized Franco-Californian company. The production of these works coincided with the disintegration of Meryon's mental health, and shortly afterwards he was committed for the first time to the Charenton Asylum, where he later died on Valentine's Day, 1868. They're the only works in Meryon's compact printed oeuvre not to have received substantial commentary. Meryon's most recent biographer, Roger Collins, suggests that the venture for which the proofs were produced was possibly fraudulent, and he's not alone in dismissing this project as of no artistic merit. Here, Collins follows Meryon himself, who described them as completely unimportant. As they weren't officially published, legal deposits of the prints weren't made at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and impressions are rare. Meanwhile, Frederick Wedmore, writing in 1892, was evidently thinking of this kind of image when he suggested that to his poverty, as well as sometimes to the whims of his later and weaker years, we owe the presence of so much which there is no need to pause over. Still, this neglect is surprising when one considers the distinctiveness of the images, their experimental quality, and the perplexing circumstances of their production. The first print, made for the Franco-Californian Pseudo-Compagnie, a relief engraving printed in dark brown ink, comprises a table of 12 cells, each one numbered, although not in order, from 1 to 18, with several numbers missing. No clues are given as to why these numbers have been chosen and others not. Still, patterns emerge. There are various ways we could read this in a sort of zigzag fashion, various sort of increments across the image for those who are better mathematicians than I am. Meryon was fascinated by puzzles and enigmas. The organization of the figures in this way, with a distribution of numerical data in vertical columns below what seems like a kind of lateral register at the top, recalls the organizations of statistical tables used for mapping probability, although the predicate here lacks a subject. Taken up with enthusiasm in the 19th century, statistical distributions undergirded actuarial knowledge, and they increasingly found graphical expression. As described, they also policed and produced forms of normativity, Quetelet's average man, for instance, that operated in the overlap between insurance and forms of social order. And for such reasons, I think it's important we don't let Meryon's biography slip wholly from view. For Meryon, art and life were entwined, and his Paris prints were, as Asher Miller puts it, an allegorical self-representation, a kind of mindscape, at least as much as they are a cityscape. Yet rather than looking to Meryon's life for an explanation of his work's distinctive melancholy, we might consider how nonconformity such as his was concurrently being examined and processed as a potential risk among many. While the typeface for the numbers is consistent, the background of each cell has a startlingly different splotchy lichen-like pattern, although they all belong to the same family type. They look, in the first take, like tickets that will be in due course cut from this single sheet, and in their prominent numbering and complex designs, they have a schematic resemblance to banknotes or other value-bearing stamps. As Jennifer Roberts has written regarding Benjamin Franklin's designs for a paper currency, which, like Meryon's proof, also used organic forms, in Franklin's case, imprints directly from the leaves of trees and plants, and which also employed a relief process. The manufacture of currency poses a problem for the ontological and practical status of printmaking. The idea of the non-reproducible reproduction that somehow manages to be both unique and identical at the same time. As Roberts notes, because the design of paper currency always sets printing against itself in this fashion, currency printing is a kind of meta-printing. Certainly, Meryon's proof evokes these characteristics of self-reflexivity and uniqueness, and whatever else they are, their attempts to probe the possibilities of the medium. But unlike Franklin's notes, there's no evidence that Meryon's proof derived from the indexical imprint of natural forms, stereotyped for consistent reproduction. But it does show an artist experimenting with randomness, maximizing and placing center stage as if a scientific diagram or items on a test card, the contingencies and mistakes of the printing process. And similar to Franklin's notes, which were backed by land assets rather than specie, Meryon's designs were inseparable from property and its value, from speculation and protection against hazard. And Franklin, it's worth noting in this context, co-founded in 1752 the first insurance company in the United States, the Philadelphia Contribution Ship, and also later pioneered life insurance. The second print is oriented horizontally, featuring a single word, France, at its center with an Etruscan design, a woman's profile in a border, and randomly placed diacritical marks. This print is more clearly a trial proof, incorporating fragments of borders and typefaces that would presumably later be incorporated into a certificate. If the majority of Meryon's practice represented modern life as archaic, the modern city haunted by a medieval shadow, these images strike me as very much of their moment. The clarity of these blocky numbers and capitalized text stands apart from Meryon's other images, which were more esoteric in their lettering. And both prints, in fact, seem to be informed by contemporary advertising or street furniture and signage, the phantasmagoric fragments of urban culture making their presence known in staccato, dreamlike form. Understood in this way, they represent Meryon's closest focus on the detail of the city's surfaces, a sharp zoom-in that contrasts with his more panoramic scenes. Like much of Meryon's work, they combine fragility and ephemerality with an inscrutability that in his Paris prints is interpreted often as a kind of timelessness. But these trials seem more wedded to their moment. They're images that speak to unknown futures rather than representing a vanishing past. What then are these strange half-works? Berti thought that Meryon's prints were involved in the counterfeiting of banknotes, prompting the artist's correction. He wrote to Berti as follows: "I made these attempts on the occasion of a plate it had been proposed I engrave, maliciously, I've since understood, for the share tickets of a company that was never realized in a project linking interests between France and California. As this type of work was far from being within my ordinary remit, my ignorance of the procedures to be followed encouraged me to make some attempts. This is how these few rare proofs were issued, trials and errors that remain completely unimportant." Despite Meryon's lack of confidence in his process, that last sentence offers backing from Greenberg's account of Meryon's risky well-madeness, trials and errors. While the works may not have been banknote designs, Berti's guess as to their function was astute, and Meryon didn't deny that this representation of complex forms of difference within a uniform structure was intended to protect against counterfeiting. In contemporary parlance, coupons, a word that moves from French into English in the 1820s, were small interest certificates printed in a grid on the same sheet below a financial bond certificate. Coupons would be cut from the sheet and at set times exchanged by the bearer for a fractional payment of interest. Now, if we read Meryon's two prints together, they seem to comprise both elements of such a document, both a certificate on the right and its accompanying coupons, an experimental artistic practice conceived in the shape of an economic exchange, promises of work to come as well as markers of future value. It seems likely that the designs were made for property developers François-Alfred Pioche and Jules Béac, who together constructed large areas of San Francisco, and who had that year commissioned from Meryon for 1,200 francs a panorama of the city. We don't know what their maliciousness was, but the project certainly gave Meryon an opportunity to give full voice to his well-developed paranoia. Pioche, whose life in California is the better documented, was less invested in profit to be made directly from mining than in opportunities the gold rush presented for real estate speculation, as in a matter of months the city appeared as if from nowhere, scrappy tents replaced by prefabricated wooden houses and a developed infrastructure. As was the case for most new arrivals in California, the careers of Pioche and Bayek, a bookkeeper, were insecure following their 1849 move to San Francisco. Although the retail and import business they first operated was a success, threats of natural disaster and economic collapse were always close by. A sequence of fires devastated San Francisco during the gold rush era. One in 1851 destroyed 3/4 of the city and displaced large numbers of people. Despite the disastrous loss of property, most of the city was at the time uninsured. The plotting of the city's street grid in the lower half of De Vere's print here prompts comparison with Meryon's coupon sheet. However, more insistently, it shows how this conflagration might be comprehended by way of information as to the precise area of the fire and the extent of the damage it caused, a perspective geared more explicitly than the more affective hilltop scene of the city in flames at the top of the image to the calibration and assessment of loss. Since the late 18th century, the township grid, expanded across the American West, had emerged as an omnipresent means of surveying and speculating on federal land. Land marked in this way was made palatable for colonization and real estate speculation, and each gridded plot was marked by a promissory note. De Vere's print shows us an image of speculative opportunity and its ruination. A rational structure of right-angled streets is undone by the blurry chaos of smoke and flames, but the order in which one should read the image isn't clear, for while the print shows the disintegration of this uniform model, a plan for its reconstruction is prefigured in the image's bottom half. By that year, Pioche was, in O.J. Rothrock's description, San Francisco's chief banker for French capital. Capitalism loves a disaster, and the 1851 fire cleared the ground for new opportunities. Having secured investors during trips back to Paris, he developed extensively on the hills above the harbour, hiring 200 French labourers to lay out Hayes Valley and the Western Addition. Real estate values fell sharply as the gold rush waned and the region began to be abandoned, so rapid development opened a vital path to future profit. And Pioche also built the first of San Francisco's urban car lines, backed the city's first gasworks, invested in new mining equipment, and was a prolific art collector. His extraction and infrastructure projects were of a piece with his aesthetic sensibility. Bayek's and Pioche's initials and portraits figure in the foreground tablet of the San Francisco print, close to allegorical figures of abundance and industry. It seems probable that rather than serving as a high-class souvenir of the city, as has been suggested, the San Francisco panorama was part of a broader attempt to legitimize the city's development as permanent and lucrative. Like the share certificates, it protected against future risk in a climate of everyday precarity. The process by which the panorama was made points not only to Meryon's increasing experimentation with his medium, this was his only etching on steel, but to the ways in which distortion and remedies for it were intrinsic to his work. He documented the laborious process of producing the panorama via multiple preparatory drawings, requiring many adjustments. While as a single landscape image rather than an image in the round, this isn't a true panorama in the technical sense, it belongs to a longer tradition of urban views. Meryon had been supplied with 5 daguerreotypes enlarged on paper, now in the Art Institute of Chicago, from which to work. The enlargements not only allowed for an expansion of the daguerreotype's limited scale, it made it possible to bring the 5 images together into a single view, and they were trimmed accordingly. Meryon made tracings on transparent paper to transfer a preparatory drawing of the image, and Rothrock notes the contradictions this commission embodied. This is him. An etching, yes, but on steel. A remarkable artist, yes, but working from photographs. A work of art made by hand, yes, but based on enlargements made by the most advanced photographic technology. Despite these tensions between the aesthetic and the purely commercial, and between different media and values, the San Francisco panorama, a print representing a city that was at this time the most daguerreotyped in America, served to ground the speculations of the 1850s in a version of reality, proving the objective existence of California's otherwise flimsy promise. Although taken from the same position, the daguerreotypes supplied to Meryon by Pioche had been made at different times of the day. Consequently, in some photographs, the light came from the left and in some from the right, to confusing effect. According to Berthy, this troubled him greatly, as did the whole plate, which in fact hastened on the course of his malady. Here, support for Roland Barthes' description of photography as a new form of hallucination, a mad image chafed by reality. Despite the lauded proto-surrealism and uncanny intensifications of Meryon's Paris plates, "What's with the dilation of the sky in Meryon's engraving?" asked Benjamin. He spent much time and energy altering various aspects of the print to correct these inconsistencies, to reconcile the ordinary and the extraordinary. Meryon's failure to fully piece together the dilating world of late gold rush California, the infrastructure and environment of which was expanding at an exponential pace, as fantasies of unlimited wealth prompted wild speculation, seems to have hurried along his breakdown. Psychological, financial, and architectural collapse haunted Meryon's work, and not just when, as in the San Francisco panorama, his gaze was forced outwards. His Paris series wasn't motivated by a wholly inward-looking form of picturesque nostalgia either. Meryon's home city was itself a construction site, with the buildings he was representing vanishing around him, and the San Francisco works and his images of Paris met on this uncertain middle ground. Delusions that he was being denied access to a fortune in gold characterized later years. As Fanny Broadwood, his half-sister, related in an 1863 letter, Charles continues the same, laboring under the extremely noxious delusion that my husband, myself, his French cousins, and several of his friends have deprived him of some enormous fortune and treasures and jewels and great masses of gold, and that we all keep him in poverty. The context for these images, and perhaps also Meryon's delusions of appropriated wealth, was specific. Following James Marshall's discovery of gold at Coloma in January 1848, large numbers of French workers emigrated to California to seek their fortune. Known as Argonauts, at the height of their presence, there were 30,000 French in the region. In the wake of the 1848 revolution, which began a month after this discovery, unemployment and economic depression encouraged many to leave, while others departed for political reasons. The majority left France with few resources or contacts in California. Gold fever was heightened in 1850 with the announcement of the so-called Lottery of the Golden Ingots, a national competition whose profits would send 5,000 French workers to California at the government's expense. Initiated by a ship owner from Le Havre, the lottery took the form of 7 million tickets sold at £1 each. First prize, the Golden Ingots, was valued at 400,000 francs, with second and third prizes of 200,000 and 100,000, alongside numerous smaller awards. The profits were estimated at 2 million francs, a boon for the shipping industry. The lottery also provided the government with a legitimate reason to police domestic unrest and reduce economic upheaval by exiling undesirable citizens. An 1850 print by Charles-Édouard de Beaumont shows a pair of sex workers, Lorette, making their pilgrimage to the New World. The gold rush also seemed to offer an opportunity to extend or recover French colonial possessions, with North America a prize target. The lottery was a news fixture in Paris through 1851. Successful Argonauts published their memoirs, numerous companies were founded, linked to mining, agriculture, real estate, and commerce, some more trustworthy than others. The director of the lottery employed Alexandre Dumas fils to write a history of the lottery, and the golden ingots were processed through Paris before being exhibited in a store on the Boulevard Montmartre. The lottery, in Dumas' reading, was all-encompassing. Life is a perpetual lottery for the benefit of death, love a lottery of the heart, ambition a lottery of the head, the future a lottery of everything. Finally drawn at the Champs-Élysées in November 1851, the lottery produced vivid rags-to-riches stories regarding the newly wealthy and was quickly linked to novel forms of melancholy. For unsuccessful participants, the completion of the lottery produced a distinct sadness associated with the thwarting of ambition, and Dumas' text, sold for the same price as a ticket, describes these cases with relish. As a lithograph by Daumier shows, California was not always a means to riches. The print depicts a well-dressed man on his way to California confronting a returning figure on the dock, emaciated in rags, with staring eyes and empty clawing hands. This is a figure of insanity. The following year, a young Jules Verne published Les Châteaux en Californie, a co-authored one-act play, never performed, about speculation in California and the follies of the gold rush. Verne addressed them several times in subsequent work in relation to its effects in Africa, America, Australia, and New Zealand. In the play, Dubourg, a Parisian architect, has left for California to make his fortune, and his wife accrues large debts in anticipation. He maps out the risky territory of the region to Madame Dubourg. You are unaware of the appalling disasters of which California is the scene, the fires every month, the fights every day, the murders every night. This gold, which you think is so easy to take, is collected with a pickaxe in one hand and a gun in the other. And for one settler who becomes rich, 1,000 die of misery and hunger. Dubourg, indeed, turns up in a threadbare state, much like Daumier's bankrupt returnee. But this, it transpires, is to test his family, as he believes himself rich, and he attempts to arrange the marriage of his daughter Henriette to Salsifikov, a Russian prince. As he puts it cynically, the heart is the capital of this limited partnership called marriage. As soon as you buy all the shares, you become the sole responsible manager. But, plot twist, Salsifikov turns out to be an imposter, neither Russian nor a prince, and Dubourg loses his entire fortune when the bank crashes, his Californian assets reduced to nothing. The message is clear. In the context of the gold rush, nothing could be taken at face value, and even the most secure investments or identities might easily go up in smoke. Many of those heading to California to seek their fortune sought life insurance policies to protect them against these hazards, thereby developing the industry across North America. Such foresight, the desire to avoid becoming the future tense version of oneself predicted in Daumier's print, was connected to transformations in perceptions of moral value in the 19th century. Some praised the moral purpose of such future planning, but others decried life and liability insurance as a threat to public morality. The idea being that if you could fall back on such techniques, individual responsibility would be abnegated and crime and corruption would ensue. The gamble on the future that travel to California involved was bound to new ways of imagining both individual subjectivity and collective obligation. Success, if found, required that one come good on the gamble, and this is Verne's character Dubourg. And I'm just not going to read this, but I'll leave it there for you. It's quite something. Incarnate in his person, Dubourg's wealth here becomes a manic form of total power. His speculative reach dominating all aspects of his workers' lives, enslaving them, in fact, and even the weather. His lack of provision for the eventual collapse provides the thrust for Verne's narrative, but not before Dubourg seeks to mitigate the risk of future emigration by bringing California to Paris, acknowledging the intimate ties that already bound them. Meryon's etchings were made from 1850 to 1854 against the background of the California gold rush, and the lottery of the golden ingots and its aftermath. Shadow Visionaries also occupied a world of mud and glitter. It is, I suggest, significant that Meryon's investment in a phantasmatic and historically dynamic image of the French capital in transformation, both highly subjective and architecturally objective, rendered on small sheets of printed paper, evolved while gold mania gripped Paris. His representation of the metropole, read often as autonomous, fetishistically insular, can be understood in relation to what it wasn't. Whereas Paris represented forms of risk that seemed to be manageable, Californian risk threatened to spiral out of control, to produce unexpected effects in Meryon's home city. In both contexts, Meryon leveraged the riskiness of print, testing its ability to bear the weight of speculative value. His gold rush images from 1855, whether coherent, like his panorama, or mysterious, like his trial-proof tokens, were but the latest iteration of a process that had begun some years earlier. Meryon never went to California, but he was an Argonaut of a different kind. Before he was a full-time artist in the period from 1838 to 46, Meryon was a sailor. In 1840, he traveled on the Montebello to Algiers, Tunisia, Smyrna, Athens, and Argos, and from 1842 on Le Rhin to Brazil, Chile, New Zealand, Australia, and Tahiti. Along the way, he made drawings, and he returned to these locations later in his career, exhibiting prints of New Caledonia in 1845 and of Akaroa in 1864 and at the 1867 Universal Exhibition. Frequently, these fragile sketches appear on very small pieces of paper, cut, coupon-like, from larger sheets. Some motifs seen on these prints appeared together for an 1866 design for a collection of etchings, the certificate-like border of which included fish, birds, Maori boats, totems, and a Haitiki amulet. Meryon's travels were never far away. Later in life, the rooms in his apartment were said to be reminiscent of the cabins of a ship. Meryon's travels in the South Pacific were formative. He was involved in attempts to establish a French colony at Akaroa on New Zealand's South Island. The whaler, Jean-François Langlois, had persuaded Kaitahu chiefs to sell him the greater part of the Banks Peninsula in 1838 and subsequently attempted to interest the French government in his scheme. Having acquired investment, Langlois aimed to secure land in New Zealand, transporting French emigrants to whale in the region, and he set sail in January 1843 with 53 emigrants. But on arrival, the British had already annexed the South Island, putting an end to French attempts to colonize New Zealand. And in this context, a work such as Ministère de la Marine, with its invading Bosch-like swarms of fantastical creatures, might be considered in a new light. Indeed, it's been read by Berthier in a letter to Victor Hugo as indicating Meryon's unease with the catastrophic slowness of the French government to respond to demands for aid by the French outpost in New Zealand. And Meryon's, in this sense, there's a sense of political critique to Meryon's work that sometimes goes undiscovered, including his own suggestion that the albatrosses and eagles that populate the skies of prints such as Le Pont-Change were baleful critiques or prophecies of the government, inflected, as James Yarnall has observed, by his fascination with idiosyncratic capitalism, homeopathic magic, and other esoteric imagery. I told you I'd get to albatrosses. One of the most insightful analyses of Meryon's work occurs in Camille's account of his etching of the Striege, often translated as the vampire perched atop Viollet-le-Duc's renovated Notre-Dame de Paris. It became the canonical image of the gargoyle, and Viollet-le-Duc visited Meryon at Charenton, gifting him a drawing in recognition of his work to popularize his achievement. Camille makes a compelling case for how Meryon's version of the stone chimera mediated between matters and personal. Meryon had used a chambre claire to make the image, which juxtaposes medieval towers and their modern incarnations. And despite its historicizing attitude, the work is fully of a piece with the 19th century media ecology into which it emerged. The domed roof of the panorama can be seen in the background, even though it no longer existed as such. And Camille argues for the chimera in the Striege, the title of which, channeling his nautical past, he'd altered from La Vigie, or the lookout, as an image of uncertain sexual desire, of somatic compulsion and its prohibition. Meanwhile, Meryon's syphilis underscored for Camille aspects of his engagement with the chimera, which remained for the artist a personal, melancholic image. The site of the gargoyles at Notre Dame was a popular suicide spot, where falling bodies echoed the reconfigured body of the impassive lookout. While during Meryon's final months, when he refused to eat or speak, he took on the mien of his most famous image. Yet alongside Camille's account of Le Striege, we might consider a lesser-known work in which organic forms took the place of carved stone rooted in the earth rather than populating the skyline. This work also prompts comparison with his Franco-Californian experiments and the culture of skyrocketing and thwarted ambition into which they appeared. In 1860, after his first spell in Charenton, Meryon made an etching called The Sick Mushroom. This strange print shows a twisted, deformed fungus bent to the right at the midway point of its stalk, then doubled back on itself in an agonizing contortion. By the third state, the background of the print had been filled with foliage and a suggestion of grassy substrate. The title was appended too, indicating that the subject's status as a cryptogame, not a champignon, was significant. Cryptogamia are plants which reproduce not by flowers or seeds, but by spores. The name means secret wedding, They were categorized as such by Linnaeus, who separated them out in his taxonomy as a discrete group of plants, divided into 4 branches. As documented by Gustave Geffroy, for Meryon, the sick mushroom personifies the inclemency, this oddity of fate that presides over incomplete, unhealthy creations. The sick mushroom wasn't just a matter of bad luck, it was just a matter of bad luck, a cosmic gamble that didn't pay off, a dud lottery ticket. It's the antithesis of Victor Hugo's Colossal Toadstool, made in 1850, which splits the sky over a gloomy landscape. Although it wasn't engraved until 1860, Meryon's cryptogram referred to an event earlier in his life when the bizarre physiognomy of the mushroom had struck him while walking on the Banks Peninsula, deployed in 1845 to protect French whalers in New Zealand. In this sense, it's a personal image, the flip side of his investment in the priapic Lestrige. It's been described as a kind of self-portrait. And reference, coming to the end, but reference to the cryptogram's self-generation and its bizarre emblematic picturing puts it too alongside the rebuses Meryon made towards the end of his life, with these oblique cryptic images, not to mention his increasingly impenetrable handwriting, as yet another object in Meryon's ever more troubled world that seemed to contain within it a secure value, even if the exact nature of that value could not be determined or easily grasped. Both cryptogamia and cities in Meryon's telling were capable of self-generation, but if the sickly cryptogram betrayed Meryon's ongoing fascination with distortion as a hermeneutic, the San Francisco panorama made 5 years earlier was an attempt to smooth things out, to put the world back together, to calibrate and assess. In the San Francisco print, the mechanical objectivity of the daguerreotypes was unexpectedly less effective at producing convincing reality effects than the reconfigured allegorical etching derived from the same scenes. Yet Meryon's attempt to conceal its fractures, we see this print at the tail end of the Californian gold rush that had made rich men of many, a visual materialization of the instability that accompanies any bubble economy. And we might discern this more directly in earlier states of the Pont au Change, where balloons preceded the clouds of birds that later appeared there. Meryon's response, however, to financial precarity was never strictly iconographical and might actually be seen more properly in the liquid aesthetic that permeates many of his images, a sense of ghost ships and wrecks, craft at sea, and so on. Meryon was usually hard up. For the Goncourt, this described the contours of his illness, his brain worn out like a pauper, and it wasn't until well after his death that his prints realized the large sums for which they now sell. In 1857, his friends organized a lottery to support him financially, the coupons for which he numbered and signed himself. Speculation was for Meryon a matter of history, global in its implications, but deeply personal. The most disquieting of capitals. This was how Baudelaire described Meryon's Paris, but he could have been talking about the chimerical qualities of the money form, or its effect on Meryon's fervent mind, his own capital. And in fact, it's in this splashy organic forms of the backgrounds of his Californian share certificates, incomplete and fragmentary, that we find something like a resurgence of the cryptogamia that Meryon discovered in New Zealand, put to more productive, at least entropic ends, reconfiguring the stunted growth of the mushroom, its doubling and its desire as the autonomous self-generation of fictitious capital. The secret weddings of which Linnaeus wrote, reproducing of their own accord, unmoored from any intrinsic values. Although it was by far from the first major disaster to befall the city, the history of San Francisco in the 19th century appears in some ways to portend the earthquake in April 1906 that killed over 3,000 people and destroyed up to 80% of the city. On that date, the accelerated building and infrastructure development that began with the discovery of gold reached a tragic apotheosis. Meryon was, of course, long dead by this point, as were those who'd commissioned his panorama and his 2 abortive trial proofs. The local environment had already prompted Pioche's downfall. A flash flood destroyed his home on Mission Street, which subsequently became known as Pioche's Pond, and he killed himself 10 years later in May 1872, most likely as a result of overconfident investments and the banking failures of 1870. The 1906 earthquake was a major event in the history of insurance. The professional calibration of risk, gaining momentum through the 19th century, made it its business to use past conditions to predict and assess the future. Still, many insurers went bankrupt, while local companies were wiped out. Others cashed in. The earthquake prompted a global re-evaluation of the legal basis of insurance and the addition of new exclusionary clauses for natural disaster. Fraudulent claims were rife. The earthquake also took its place in the history of photography. Among many astonishing images of the city in ruins or still on fire, panoramic photographs were particularly powerful, returning to a format that had been a familiar means of representing the city since its construction in the 1850s and pursued by Muybridge in the late 1870s. Some, such as George R. Lawrence, saw an opportunity to expand the format, taking vertiginous aerial shots of the ruined city from a kite-borne camera. Others focused on specific sections of the city, and the photographs were widely published. In some of these photographs, earlier images are replayed through the prism of the disaster's news cycle, collapsing different times and spaces and haunting the present catastrophe with the memory of a more optimistic time. A remarkable photograph by Alfred Genther shows leisurely bourgeois viewers taking in the spectacle from the hills above the city, the pose of the reclining man mirroring that of the allegorical figure of industry in Meryon's panorama. Meryon's wildly dilating sky returns here as an ash cloud, and industry becomes a witness. Genther's documentation of the disaster-struck city speaks across the decades to Meryon's figuration of future risks, future ruins in Paris, made half a century earlier. The allegory of endurance and loss that defined Meryon's Paris plates was never just nostalgic. It was tied to ways of speculating on the future and securing against risk on the other side of the world, a future in which eventually the worst possible thing to happen finally came to pass. Thank you.
So we've got some mics for questions you may have, the Q&A. First in class history. No questions after them.
Good talk. Thanks.
Thank you for your talk. It was incredibly engaging, and the images are fantastic. The image of industry that you have brings to mind Thorstein Veblen's writings around the turn of the century about industry being distinct from capitalist development. There are other systems that can exist. Industry must remain and must be developed. I'm curious if, for Meryon, was he seemingly at the end of his life losing his mind in a certain sense, but was he politically active in any sense throughout his time of artistic production? Did his travels imbue in him any sense of direction there?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. He wasn't politically active in the context of his travels as such. He was politically active in and around the 1848 revolution. So, he claimed he was involved in street fighting during the revolution. So, certainly in a number of images, he read them himself as being critiques of official symbolism. That his sort of more esoteric imagery worked against the official account, as it were. So, I mean, in a way, we could probably fold that back into an understanding of his travels and his sort of various peregrinations around the world, given that so many of those who were exiled during during the Gold Rush era were being exiled because of the 1848 revolution, and they were being sent abroad for political reasons. So by the end of his life, I mean, it's really, really hard to tell. I mean, it takes on a more, he wasn't very well. So I wouldn't read too much of that in terms of a political dimension. And mostly it was about, it took a slightly more paranoid turn. Thank you.
Thank you for that very stimulating and thought-provoking talk. I just want to add an extra perspective, which is especially your comparison between the photographs, the daguerreotypes of San Francisco, together with Meryon's print, brought to mind. I think, if I'm not mistaken, this is roughly about the same time when the introduction of photography in art history proper is actually very much discussed. And the frustration of the photograph that is taken at different times of the day and has different shadows, which Meryon in a way actually corrected in his print, reminds me of an argument that the German art historian August Schmarsow actually brought forward, who said that he actually says he would prefer the reproductive engraving to the photograph, because all the photograph can do is to document the here and now of the artwork. And the example he takes is Leonardo's Last Supper in Milan, which is pretty much all gone, terribly destroyed. Whereas the reproductive engraving, for which a photographer is actually, a printmaker is actually get a stipend from the German state to stay 3 years in Italy, to use preliminary sketches and all do that thing to create a gigantic reproductive print to bring back the idea of Leonardo's painting. And he prefers that. And I think something like that, and it's actually, the synchronicity is actually kind of very fascinating. It happens kind of about this at the same time.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think these images give the lie to teleologies of media change that suggest that photography turned up one day and got rid of printmaking. We know that isn't true. Extremely high value intaglio prints are being made well into the 20th century, and the kind of truth that's attached to them is often understood as being greater than that of photography. So the fact that Meryon's engraving succeeds on these terms, whereas the daguerreotypes don't, is interesting in that respect. It's also a moment where we're starting to see the shift from daguerreotypes to paper photography as being the most widespread means by which one would encounter such things. This hadn't quite happened in San Francisco at this point, but it's really telling that Beck and Pioche go to a French artist to make this panorama, partly because these discussions around the various truth claims of different media are being fought out in Paris in a really concentrated manner at this time. So, it's a live issue, and I think that's one of the reasons why he gets this commission in the first place. And he's not even working from the daguerreotypes, he's working from enlargements after the daguerreotypes as well. So there are all kinds of substitutions of different media that are happening at this point.
Thanks for a very thought-provoking talk and a wonderful sort of social history of the circumstances in which these prints were made. One of the things that struck me is another way the word risk might have been developed, and rather than financial and capitalist adventures and so on, I was thinking about the risk that's taken in the etching medium itself, that what's represented is only sort of hinted at. It can never actually achieve the views that it purports to represent. That the medium insists on intervening somehow between the producer and the recipient in a way that implies risk, that the etcher is himself or herself engaging in a risky process. And just another dimension of what you were talking about.
Thank you. Yes. I mean, I don't think this is quite where Greenberg was going, but that's how I'm reading Greenberg, is that I think he, I think that is something that he pointed us towards to some extent, and that this sort of contingency that governs printmaking is inherently risky. That there's something about not only his artistic mark making, but also about the process that is risky. I should say too that printing can be a dirty, dangerous business too, and Meryon was slightly careless in his, he had acid burns on his hands. He was damaged by the process of making his prints as well. So there's a kind of violence as well, I think, that is apparent in the prints, and this came through in the show actually, where there's that sort of links between the sort of cutting of the plate and flagellation, for instance, in other works. But it's a violence that's there in Meryon's practice too, even though they seem so meticulous and that they're not that expressive. But still, it had a sort of physical effect on him. And of course, yes, you don't know what you're going to get out of a printing press when you put it in. You can make a pretty good guess, and there are different levels of expertise, obviously, but there are still aesthetic, technical risks involved. But there's also the possibility, I suppose, of reparation to some extent, in that you can make another state and you can adapt and rework the plate.
One more.
Thank you so much. I'm fascinated by the organic forms on the so-called coupons and the malignant mushroom, right? And I was wondering how, these contemporaneous developments in the life sciences and biology, for example, you mentioned Linnaeus and Canguilhem, and I'm thinking of Darwin and Lamarck as well, how these, developments affected the sort of speculation over life and life insurance and the value of life as well. And also thinking about prints as this kind of, reproducible in a biological sense medium that is, spreading like, viruses or bacteria, and these kind of connections.
Thank you. Yes, I hadn't thought about them quite in that way, but I think there's something about the shared organic quality of the coupons and works such as the sick mushroom that is quite telling, not only because they sort of seem to spring from nowhere, but they're tied very much to ideas about fortune, but also to certain ideas about the pathological as well. Certainly that's how Meryon read the sick mushroom. He saw it, described it as a kind of self-portrait, and says, this is me, this puny, distorted creature that I came across is me, and he's returning to this mushroom many years after having seen it in New Zealand. So that's kind of an interesting folding in of organic form into the process. But yeah, I think there are certainly ways in which questions about risk were not just linked to insurance practices. There's something that were pervasive across the scientific method more generally as well. So, I think if we were to sort of expand that out, you could certainly look in that direction. Thank you. Thank you.